Tell your story.
Change the conversation.
Organized by students.
TEDxYouth at SHC.
If I presented you with a list of waste items and asked you to sort them into their proper bins, how well do you think you'd be able to do it? When I presented this very task to a group of 100 students and adults, none of them were able to do it with complete accuracy. This is unsurprising, as the United States Environmental Protection Agency estimates that the vast majority of the US waste stream could be recycled or composted, and yet we're only doing so for just over 34% of it. But why? It seems to be a paradox that individual behavior is both essential and inconsequential. The problem with waste sorting is that its effects can't be perceived right away, so there exists little incentive to integrate it into one's everyday life. This idea relates to Israeli historian and author Yuval Noah Harari's observation that our lives are governed by fictions: money, borders, corporations, government, religion, among others. These are examples of societal institutions perpetuated by our collective imagination, but which are, objectively speaking, meaningless. While the examples I mentioned are relatively concrete, I believe there also exist more subtle, abstract fictions which the human race has created to meet our modern needs. One such fiction is what I like to call the concept of a way. Imagine for a moment this morning's breakfast. Let's say you stopped by your local cafe to pick up your daily morning coffee and a blueberry scone. Armed with a full stomach and a renewed sense of caffeinated alertness, you've finished your breakfast and are ready to dispose of your waste. So absent-mindedly, you make your way over to the nearest trash can. If you happen to be the environmentally conscious type, you might even search the vicinity for a recycling or compost bin. But alas, you find only a nondescript gray container sitting unaccompanied in the corner of the room. Oh well, you think, as you toss your waste in, this'll do. We've all been there, myself included, and it's easy to view such a seemingly minor transgression as inconsequential. But it does matter. Perhaps the largest humanitarian injustice of our time is that you, with your pastry wrapper and coffee cup, don't have to care where your waste ends up or how others who may be less fortunate will be affected by it in the future. But why should you care? After all, it is difficult to train oneself to behave in a way that is unsupported by an action's immediately perceived consequences. In behavioral science, this is called the present bias, which describes the tendency of people to favor payoffs that are closer to the present time when considering trade-offs between two future outcomes. So in this case, convenience outweighed the incentive to seek out the proper receptacle, and the projected negative impact from your decision seemed relatively minor. But this kind of behavior is not unique to decisions involving waste sorting. In fact, it explains why we as individuals and our society as a whole are generally apathetic toward even the most pressing environmental issues. Our brains are simply not wired to respond to the kinds of changes that we're experiencing now with our modern global environmental change. Our Earth is transforming right before our eyes so quickly, and yet, these effects are simultaneously too gradual for the brain to understand them as imminently threatening. But let's go back to trash and examine individual waste sorting behavior on a larger scale. Take electronic waste, for example. Together, the United States and China generate 1/3 of the world's total e-waste. Just today, Americans will throw away 350,000 cell phones and 130,000 computers. In 2014, the non-governmental organization Basel Action Network partnered with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to launch their e-Trash Transparency Project, a study designed to track the global movement of US electronic waste across the globe with the use of GPS technology. US e-waste does not remain domestic. In fact, as you can see, it ends up all across the globe. When the findings from this study were released in 2016, Basel Action Network estimated that 96% of US e-waste exports were likely to be illegal under United States or international law. The transboundary trade in hazardous waste leaves developing countries with a difficult choice. Either accept the damaging consequences that come with the importation of hazardous waste in exchange for much-needed capital, or utilize often limited resources in an attempt to ban illegal importation. Whether we like it or not, our waste makes us a globalized community, and until we treat it as such, it will continue to pose a threat to both public health and to the environment. On an international level, environmental legislation can be seen as an act of balance between the interests of various economic players and ecological protection. In the case of international waste politics, there exists an imbalance between the short-term economic interests of rich, developed countries and those of the poor, future generations, and the environment. Because world leaders maintain the power to stop the discussion of these uncomfortable subjects at the highest levels of government, the scope of interests encompassed within the international community's position on waste issues ends up remaining quite narrow. Against multinational agreements, the United States consistently works in direct opposition to environmental justice overseas by continuing to export toxic waste to countries that offer to pay for it. And once it has entered the realm of away, the waste can be forgotten and our collective conscience eased. Part of the reason for our American ignorance of the magnitude of our global trash problem lies in the way that we pay for our waste management services. Unlike other utilities, most US municipalities offer flat-fee trash pickup. So without pricing that is proportional to waste volume, there exists no incentive for people to limit or even pay attention to their consumption. The efficiency of our waste disposal in this country is such that we as Americans are oblivious to the fact that over half of the world does not even have access to regular trash collection services. Those of us in industrialized societies maintain the power of not having to think about it, and as a result, those who contribute least to our global environmental crisis pay the highest price. But the root of the problem remains waste itself. So one way to prevent the continued generation of non-biodegradable waste is to adopt a cradle-to-cradle approach to consumer production, thereby eliminating waste at its source. By creating products which, upon disposal, can either be rematriculated back into the environment or remain within closed-loop industrial cycles, we can reinvent the very nature of manufacturing. There is no away for any of us. Your waste becomes my waste, our waste, together. So next time you're standing in front of a trash can with your paper coffee cup and pastry wrapper, consider the significance of your decision. The time for ignorance, whether willful or simply negligent, is over. Our world is a closed system, and one day, not so far in the future, we will be forced to treat it as such. By the time that day comes, it will have already been too late. Thank you.